I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. We have a special San Diego edition this time, which I know happens a lot, but a couple things. The last episode, we finally got back on track on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, and we will be doing another episode of that coming up. So make sure to read, if you're reading along, The Weapons Shop by A.E. von Vogt from 1942. That will be the next story we're covering. So, but we've got some cool interviews coming up, including James Chambers. And, but today, Kristina, is it Grifant?
Close.
I'm always starting off.
Everybody has like different ways of pronouncing it. Usually I go with Grifant. Yeah, KC Grifant is my pen name.
Grifant. Yeah. Okay. So I'm a bad host. I was going to do that beforehand and forgot. The dog whining to get in the door, who I'm probably going to have to let in as soon as you start talking, distracted me. So, but yeah, Kristina is a local San Diego author, part of our Horror Writers Association and co-chair of last year's Stokercon. So, Kristina, why don't you start off by telling us how you got involved with horror and how horror became a thing in your life?
Yeah. I think like most horror fans, I've always enjoyed it, but I didn't really think of myself as a horror author until I came to San Diego, actually, about 9 years ago. I was looking for a writers group. I didn't really know anyone in San Diego, and I had tried fantasy, sci-fi, like general literary groups, and nothing quite clicked. I had always thought of myself as like a sci-fi author, but kind of with a dark twist sort of thing, and a fantasy author. But in looking around, I discovered the Horror Writers Association, HWA, and the closest chapter was in LA, which I don't know if everyone knows, but from San Diego to LA, it's not a great drive. So I didn't want to do that every month. So I poked around and I found that we had enough like interest locally to start our own chapter. So I co-founded the San Diego chapter of the HWA. It's probably like 7 or 8 years ago now. And it's grown. There are so many talented horror writers and fans in San Diego. I think more than I had ever guessed. And we have just a very vibrant literary scene here in San Diego, both horror and other genres. So it was really great to start that up and connect people. And as you mentioned, we hosted the Stokercon, which is HWA's big annual conference here in San Diego in 2024, and that was a lot of fun. Yeah, so that's sort of how I came to it. But growing up, I always enjoyed like Tales from the Crypt, Twilight Zone, like kind of that campy, pulpy horror. Not really slashers or super gory stuff that kind of made me anxious and still does, but like monsters I really love. And stories where you find out things kind of aren't as they seem.
Did you have any authors that when you were, well, first of all, where did you grow up? I've never asked you this, and I feel like this is a faux pas on my part as somebody who knows you locally. So where did you grow up, Kristina?
Yeah, so I have always lived on the East Coast until I moved to San Diego. I grew up in various places, but mostly Delaware, and then lived in New York, Manhattan for a while, and then Boston for a good chunk of my kind of graduate school, early career life. And from Boston, moved to San Diego almost a decade ago now.
So you would say Delaware was kind of the formative?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. See, because for me, Indiana was a huge part of it because we had a horror host who introduced like a whole generation of kids in my state to horror. And so I do always ask people questions geography wise, because I'm always wondering if there was something locally that, was a part of it. But was it movies or reading or, like what first attracted you to the genre?
Yeah, I think it was probably movies and shows first. In terms of reading, I was definitely more of like full-on fantasy escapism, like, other worlds, sword fighting and dragons. I love that growing up, as well as kind of the coming of age stories. But for horror, I loved Are You Afraid of the Dark and Tales from the Crypt. I did love reading Goosebumps as well and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, like those kinds of, right, YA horror. But I would say it was more like shows for sure, especially around the sci-fi horror.
Well,
So
those literary influences actually make sense because your stories are all most of them are very short and punchy and to the point, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so I kind of see that influence there too. I'm sure you probably read the big names like King and Kuntz and those folks too,
I
or
did,
no?
yeah. I liked Kuntz a lot, more for the again, like sci-fi horror was my sweet spot as opposed to pure horror. So I didn't read Stephen King until later. But definitely, movies like Aliens, I was obsessed with. And I loved reading Frankenstein. Like, for whatever reason, that book, just again, kind of sci-fi horror, right? I was obsessed with Frankenstein. I wrote like fan fiction. Like, I was just really into it in middle school and high school.
Well, a lot of us were, it is, one of the progenitors of the entire genre, as it were. So, Frankenstein is obviously like a huge one, but and so, kind of getting into this more seriously from a position of finding the horror writers, did you find yourself having to kind of adjust from like it? Now you write very good science fiction as far as like stories that are in here that are science fiction, like work very well with the world building, but did you find yourself shifting to write horror because this was the community that you found, right?
Hmm.
Was that something that you found yourself doing, or was it just like a natural, like fits like a glove kind of thing?
I feel like it was fairly natural. And I guess, for a lot of people, until they realize, horror is a very diverse genre, like some people might feel like they don't fit in it. And that's where I was. I didn't write super gory stuff, no slashers, no serial killers. So I didn't think of myself as a horror writer for a very long time until kind of getting connected with the HWA and local authors and seeing the diversity of horror, right? There's like some people write humorous horror, some people write horror poetry. I mean, there's such, as we know, a huge variety that seeing that helped me kind of embrace like the kind of title of horror author and also just at a deeper level feeling really connected to those writers. Whereas for whatever reason, I had a hard time connecting to writers in the past and writers groups. I think this happens with a lot of people in genre fiction. You go to like a general literature class or conference, and you're like the oddball out, right? Everybody's writing their memoirs or nonfiction or serious literary fiction, and you just feel like such like an outcast. So that was like most of my experience until I came to San Diego and connected with horror writers, and then it just felt like home in a way, which was very nice.
Well, and I always say like I feel I'm more connected, like passion wise, with science fiction, but I've always felt more connected to the horror community. And I think one of the reasons why, and now I've published a lot of horror, but the thing is that I feel like forever the writers in horror, there was less of a barrier between, as it like in punk rock we always say like there's no barrier between the stage and the musicians and the crowd, like, you know everybody hangs out. It's like, and I think that's kind of true with horror, is like I always felt like there were horror writers I could meet, I could talk to, and the community was much easier to become a part of. And I'm sure it sounds like you found that to be true too. And that can be inspiring for writing as well.
For sure. And I've heard a lot of people say that, horror writers are some of the friendliest people they've ever met, right? And I think generally that holds true. Like, as you say, the horror community is pretty welcoming, pretty open, pretty diverse and supportive. Whereas some other cliques of writing groups can be a little more competitive or, sometimes toxic, as we've seen in the news over the last few years. But horror writers, tend to be a pretty good group overall.
Yeah, we have our share of bad apples as well, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
This collection, and I've got my copy right here, Shrouded Horror. Before we start talking about this, first publishing wise, in a book sense, you started a series with of weird westerns, so that had been kind of your focus, and I think and I said in my review, which of this book, which will be coming out soon, I had this kind of stereotype in my mind that because you were writing historical horror, and like it almost feels somewhat, even though it's set in the West, it feels almost kind of Victorian to me. So reading your modern stuff in here was a little bit of a surprise, because part of the stereotype is, oh, she writes weird Western, she must really like to write historical fiction. Do you have a passion for historical fiction, or how did the weird Western thing happen? And can you tell us about your series there?
Yeah, it's very, I think, random and not how most people come to write Westerns. So I didn't really watch Westerns growing up, like didn't read them. It felt like a very, very kind of macho, very specific and stereotypical genre. So I really didn't have any interest in it. When I moved to San Diego, I became involved in a local game group, and one of the games they played was called Doomtown, which is based on the Deadlands universe, which some people may be familiar with. It's been around for a while. But what really caught my attention was seeing the diversity of characters in the cards, especially women. So seeing women gunslingers and outlaws and in all these roles that I had never seen in a Western setting. So I became pretty involved in that community, and I wrote some of the official card game stories. And I really enjoyed it. So I thought, let me make my own kind of Weird West world and mythos. And it was pretty well received. I started with short stories and then thought, well, let me try a novel. People seem to like the characters. The main character is essentially a kind of gender swapped archetype of the stoic cowboy. So Melinda West is her name, and she's a gunslinger, and she and her partner exterminate monsters in the Old West. So it's kind of fun, pulpy. I'm able to write it episodically, which I like, right? They kind of come across one monster and have to defeat it, kind of like little X-Files episodes. But yeah, I didn't, the Western mythos, I hadn't really been involved in it or very like interested in it. But now I feel like there is kind of this resurgence in Westerns and weird Westerns, which, is a Western with some speculative element, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, horror. And there's a lot of diverse weird Westerns coming out over the past few years. And it's really interesting because it's a new way to look at this Old West mythos, which has been very kind of specific, very kind of white male focused, as most of us know. But now there's all these other stories coming up. And as a writer, it was really interesting to research actual events in history in the Old West and see all of these stories of women doing interesting things that we never really saw, or those stories weren't told. So I use those as inspiration for the series. The first book, Melinda West, Monster Gunslinger, came out last year from Bridget's Gate Press. The second one is coming out next year, and they're standalone books, but interconnected, right? So not a series with cliffhangers, but more these longer kind of adventures. And it's really fun and different because I'm used to writing kind of more what you see in Shrouded Horror, which is near future, contemporary horror, weird situations, a little bit of sci-fi in there. some dark fantasy. So the historic Western is just really just this world and series, oddly enough.
Well, and what I find kind of fun about this is that I'm sure you probably ended up now having to kind of go back and start watching westerns, whether you like the vibe of them or not. You probably have to kind of to feel like. Have you found any westerns where you're like, wow, I'm surprised, I really liked that one? Like,
Yeah, it's more contemporary though. So for example, Prey, the Prey, that came out what 2 years ago. That's kind of Predator in the Old West with this indigenous group having to deal with the monster. Like that is my favorite. It's really great, very well done. In terms of the older stuff, I've been watching them. A lot of them I kind of stop halfway because it's the same sort of story, but some of them are fun. Um, the other one I reference, which is not truly a Western, but is Back to the Future 3 when they go to the Old West. Like I love that aesthetic and just the kind of fun adventure to it and the time travel. So the Westerns I like are kind of more these random oddball ones.
have you ever seen Eastwood's The Unforgiven? I
It's high on my list. Everybody says that is the one to watch.
The Unforgiven you must see The Unforgiven. But
Yes.
the other thing that can maybe make it more interesting for you is there is a Japanese filmmaker who did a almost shot for shot remake using the same screenplay and made it in Japan.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah, with all like set in the like the end of the Shogun era, which is fun because one of the things about in the 50s, a lot of the westerns and samurai movies, they were just swapping plots and remaking each other, and switching out gunslingers for samurais. And like Fistful of Dollars and is just a remake of Yojimbo, the
Oh,
Kurosawa
right.
samurai movie, but with just a
Yeah.
gunslinger. And so one of the funny things that if I have always thought about, if I was writing a bunch of old West stuff, I as a fan of Asian cinema, I think that's a fun track to kind of take classic tales and set them in the old West. So there's so much you can do, and yeah, I look forward to reading that
Yeah.
series as it goes. And but let's get into the short story collection because this is your newest release.
Yep.
Um, were you these were not written with a collection in mind, right? These are just works that you published. So my first short story collection, Screams from a Dying World, had a theme, and both my short story collections I kind of planned out as a theme, and I published a few here and there, but like I wrote to a theme, but it seems like you were just collecting the stuff that you sold, or am I wrong?
I would say a little bit of both. So a lot of the stories, not all, not all of the stories were published previously, but I've had a lot of short stories kind of that I've worked on, that I've published. So I finally hit a number where I thought, okay, I think I have enough for a collection. I didn't include everything. So I was really looking for stories that have this sort of loose theme of like horror, shrouded horror, horror just at the edge of reach, just at the edge of reality, typically everyday situations, but something strange happens. So that was the loose theme I was going for. So that's why I say it's a little bit of both. So it's not just everything I've written thrown into one, but it wasn't writing specifically for a theme. So,
Did you
I don't
have
know.
a real favorite story that just didn't fit that you really wished you could have put in there, or did you
I
force
did
any in?
actually. I had a few. One was like a dark fantasy one, but it really kind of didn't fit. I had some westerns, but I'm saving those for a Weird West collection later on. But yes, there were a few. I just thought, they're not quite right. Maybe in a future collection they'll work out.
Well, right. And, there is diversity to these stories, though. I mean, because there's a couple that are straight up science fiction, and then there's some that are a little bit weirder, and there's a few that I would say are funny. So, like, one of the things I look for in a collection generally is a little diversity of seeing what the author can do. And not every author has to do that. Brian Evanson has entire collections that are the exact same tone, and I'm super happy to read those too. But because the tone he's hitting is awesome. But one of the things I really did like about this is that there is different vibes to the stories. How did you go about selecting the order of the collection? I'm always interested in that. Because there's a certain rhythm to a collection, and before I put a collection together, I used to read out of order. Now that I've done it myself, I realize that authors are putting them in an order for a reason. And
totally.
Yeah. So any thoughts on that?
It's really interesting because I sort of feel like my collection at least is almost like a portfolio, right? Like so I wanted to showcase, as you say, diversity in style and approach with also a loose theme. So part of it was selecting stories that were well received of the previously published ones, right? So I wanted to start with something kind of lighter and funner, like a little more, I don't know, drawing in the reader, right, before getting too serious. So that is sort of the rhythm I set and followed. Here's like a fun, lighter one. Here's maybe a slower, kind of quiet horror. Here's like a shorter, fast-paced one. So just really getting at that variety was my goal. And the order felt pretty natural. I tweaked it a little bit, but I think it pretty much stayed with the original plan I had.
Well, and we'll get a little bit into some spoiler territory and talk more deeply about the stories in a little bit, but I wanted to this part of it is for the people who have not maybe gotten it yet, and we're definitely going to try to talk them into picking up this collection. How did the book come together with the publisher and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I had it, sort of assembled, ready to go. I started pitching it, and then I had a pitch session at Stokercon last year in Pittsburgh, and that's where I met the editor and publisher of Dragon's Roost Press, which is a small press. And he really liked kind of the cosmic horror, weird horror aspect. So he's the one who ended up connecting with me, and they've been a really great partner in terms of being very flexible. And as we know, a lot of small presses, the benefit is the author has a say on the cover, on all kinds of things. So that was really great. Yeah, it was a good experience.
Nice. Well, and it's cool that you got it on a Stokercon pitch.
That's great.
Yeah, in Pittsburgh, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So what I want to say before we get into some more details for the people who might be like on the edge, well, first of all, Kristina, for those of you who were at StokerCon who had a great time, and there's close to 700 of y'all this year, this one put a lot of work into it. So a good way to return the favor is to pick up one of her books. I think this is a great selling point for this book, for nothing else. I had a hilarious situation of how I ended up with this book is I just had my backpack sitting in the volunteer room at StokerCon on Saturday. And I had people had been giving me books the whole weekend. So I had a bag of books. And when I left it there all weekend, and when I got home, I pulled it out and I was like, "Oh, there's Kristina's book," and I don't know who put it in my bag.
No, either. It wasn't me, I swear. And you're not the only person that happened to. So I think somewhere someone just took
Started
the art,
sticking them,
put them in random bags, which I really appreciate. I'm so glad you got a copy.
Right. And so I was very stoked that I ended up with a copy, and so yeah, and one of the things that just kind of worked out on timing is that for the first time in a long time, I haven't written short stories in a long time. I've been very focused on novels, and I spent 2 years working on a nonfiction book. So this summer, I suddenly got a bunch of anthology and anthology invites, and all of a sudden, I had to start writing a bunch of short stories for the first time in a while. So I put a ton of short story collections on my TBR, like back to back to back. And so reading this in the middle of that was really nice timing.
Worked
So,
out.
yeah, it worked out. And what I really appreciate, there's a couple things that I really appreciate about what you're doing, Kristina. And before we get into actually talking about the individual stories, is I just want everyone to know that the fact that I I asked this question as a part of the interview, but I knew from already talking to you that you really started getting more serious about horror and being a part of the horror scene when you moved to San Diego. I knew that. And so I kind of felt like one of the things that is kind of a neat part of this is that there's a little bit of seeing your evolution as a horror writer through some of these stories. And because they're out of order and they're not published in the order of which you wrote them, it's kind of fun to think about for me reading them, to think about where you were in that journey, because some of the stories are more East Coast based, and
Yeah.
and, and and so that's a lot of words of me talking, but but what I wanted to say is that I really enjoyed seeing and knowing that you were experimenting with the form and horror a lot in it. It's one thing to read a collection by, let's say, Ramsey Campbell, who's been doing it for 45 years, And what I really kind of enjoy sometimes is when you see authors like kind of growing on the page, and sometimes those moments of ingenuity like actually feel stronger because you can feel the author like hitting notes, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I always talk about, and I quote science fiction writer Rudy Rucker always talks about, the genres have power chords. They have certain like things that, so like the zombie story in here is like you playing one of those power chords, or serial killer story, or a story that involves a cemetery, or whatever. One of the things I liked was seeing you hit some of these notes and hit some of these power chords. And so what I want the listeners to know is that this is a very it's a very traditional horror collection, but it's one that they're really going to enjoy, and it's going to hit a lot of the notes that you're looking for, right? So
I appreciate that. And yes, you're right. Some of the stories are several years older, so there is an evolution there that's out of order. But like you, I really enjoy seeing that when I read an author, like, for example, their first novel, their debut novel, right, versus their sixth novel. The debut is very interesting in and of itself, right? Because you can kind of see them maybe experiment a little more, maybe just, trying to find their way a bit. And it's so interesting. As writers, we are trying to constantly evolve, and I love seeing that on the page.
Yeah, and I admit that when I read a collection, a lot of times I will float around to the acknowledgments to see where it was published, to see, oh, I wonder, also because in some of these cases, the editors of these individual publications can have a huge influence on the author's take, right? And also their growth, because you get influenced by, James Beach from Dark Discoveries had a huge influence on me for, now I did get published with him, but a story he rejected. I learned a lot from working with James, and I know between the first story and the second story that I was hitting a lot of the notes that he wanted me to, right? And and before we get into the stories, anything you want to say about any of the editors you worked with in the various
They've all been
Well,
so great. As you mentioned, I list out quite a few in the acknowledgments, and I'm so grateful to all of them because, well, for the most part, they're all indie publishers, a lot of anthologies and magazines, but just their kind of willingness to publish weird horror and horror off the beaten path, not just mine, but the work they do. They make the horror indie community what it is, right? We wouldn't exist if those publishers weren't out there. And sometimes they're really grinding, right? It's one person, they have a day job, they're like trying to run an online magazine or a publishing house, and I'm so deeply appreciative of them.
all right, so this is going to be a short spoiler section because but I just got to get into a couple of the stories. So, if you have not read Shrouded Horror and you want to, this is a good time to pause this here podcast, go buy the book, keep it in your podcatcher, come back after you've read the book, and maybe I will hit on some of the things that you wanted to know. A couple of the stories that I want to comment on. One of the first ones the first one that really hit me was All Aboard, which and I gotta. So All Aboard is one of that kind of New York City stories. If I get one of the stories wrong from my memory, just correct me. But All Aboard is one of the New York stories, and one of the things, and this is a trick. You're not the first person to do this, but the character doesn't know the names of all the people that are around them, so it has to kind of go by like some of these descriptions, right? Of the characters. Can you tell me a little bit about writing this story, All Aboard, and what it says about New York City?
Yeah, so this is what I would consider a pandemic story, which I think have fallen out of style a bit, but it is a pandemic story in that it's a near future world. There's the sickness going around. The main character is in a grocery store and he's kind of marked as being exposed. So he is sent out in what's called a Q boat, quarantine boat. So you have these boats sort of floating in the harbor outside of the city, people waiting, for their exposure time to be done. But the story started with an image that I saw, and it was an image of a boat at night looking at New York. And it felt very lonely and sad. And
Yeah.
that's sort of how it started. And, being on a boat with a small group of people captures that isolation, I think, to some degree, and also becomes a microcosm, right? You have people who are in denial, people who are angry, and most importantly, people who are ready to be quick with blame. And that's sort of where the story takes off. And that's
Well,
bad.
and I highlighted this in my review, which should be coming out before this podcast drops. But one of the things I liked is that in the same paragraph where Maurice is kind of naming everybody, it kind of ends with this one little note of world building, about like the pandemic conditions, which is very good world building, and an excellent moment of writing. But then also there's this passage where you're kind of describing like how he's kind of getting lost and seeing like kind of visions in the water. And I actually thought this passage is very vivid and descriptive, but it it also like helps guide the reader into kind of feeling this character's fear a lot. And so I just wanted to say that I thought that was one of the best moments of writing in the collection. Is one that I was really fond of. I don't know if this is an earlier or later story, but a really effective moment, and really helped ground this story, which is somewhat speculative in nature because it's a far worse pandemic than the one we just kind of survived. So
Yeah, thank you. It is a later story. And to your question about the naming of the characters not having their actual names, right? That's just sort of how people seem to operate during the pandemic as well, right? And any
yeah.
political situation, really. It's like they're not our opposers are not people to us necessarily. So in this instance, he is giving them nicknames based on traits, but not knowing much about them, right? And that's the case with all of them. They're just in the situation. They're not friends. They don't know each other's backgrounds. They're in a bad situation.
Right. And so Unrest is another story that's kind of New York, um, uh, very New York centric, and this is the one. Was it Unrest or is it U Train? Am I thinking?
U Train is the subway. Unrest is the cemetery.
All right, U Train is the one I'm thinking of. Right. So that was another one of the stories that really worked for me super well was the U Train one. Partially, I mean, I've spent time in New York City, so I know a little bit about the subway, but I kind of liked this. I really liked the creepiness of like kind of like the train's not coming, and when you just you know when you're sitting there waiting for the train, if it's late, right, you just assume it's going to come, and then part of living in that city is you expect everything's going to work. So a lot of times people will be sitting there reading and they'll just miss it. Anyways, that was a concept or one that worked really, really well for me. I thought that was an excellent story, and one of the best of the collection. So big thumbs up on that one. Is there anything you want to tell me about writing that story?
Yeah, that was inspired directly from my time waiting for subways. I lived in Manhattan in my early 20s, so a lot of late nights, and I'd be waiting for the subway 4 a.m. And at 4 a.m., the subway's going to come eventually, but it takes a long time. Like you're there for a while. So you see a lot of interesting characters and everybody's kind of out of it, kind of drunk, whatever. And it's just a really weird space. And I don't know, there's something unique about it, like sort of charming in a really kind of grim, like way. Yeah, you see the rats running around. I mean, it's dirty, it smells weird. Somebody's like smoking over there, somebody's urinating over there. Part of the charm of New York. But that was where the story sort of started, and these imaginings of, okay, what if it never comes, and what if I'm stuck here forever, and what does that mean, and what if I'm stuck with these three other people waiting forever, and what does that mean, and then kind of took it from there.
Yeah, I would say this is probably my favorite story in the collection. So I think it's the best execution of a concept where it felt familiar enough to me that I was like, oh yeah, I see what she's doing, and I really understood the setting and where it came from, and that whole thing of a writer when game recognizes game. I kind of like I'm doing basketball talk. Game recognizes game, but I and I mean this in a good way. I saw what you were doing. I knew where you were going, and it still worked for me. And I was very excited about it because I don't think the general reader would, but a writer who understands what you're trying to express. Like I felt like I was in good hands. That's why I say that about. I always talk about the thing. I'm a structure guy, and that's one of the reasons why I like F. Paul Wilson. Is like he doesn't necessarily like sometimes the stories will surprise me, but I don't need to be surprised if I feel like the story is doing exactly what I think it should do.
Right, right. It's a fine balance, right? You
Yeah.
don't want it to be boring and predictable, but it should be satisfying. One quick thing on that story, U Train, it actually won a podcast competition few years ago from House Publishing. So they produced a like dramatic audio production of it, which was so cool because each character was a different voice actor. So they were
Ooh.
the ones who first published it. Yeah, I'll have to send you the link for that. They
Yes,
did such a
please.
great job.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really dig that one. Now, if I have something negative to say, I want to say that From Sea to Shining Sea was too short, and that could have been a novel or a novella, or it could have been like lots of things. There is so much packed into that little story. I was just getting like going on, and I'm like, what? That's it. So that is my complaint right
Okay.
there.
All right.
Is,
Noted.
is that should have been more. What do you want to tell me about that one? Because man, that was a great setup. It was a
Yeah,
great
okay.
setup.
Well, then you'll be happy to know that actually was a spin-off story for a longer sci-fi novel that I have worked on a very long time. And actually, um, I hit a writer's block for like 5 years. I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. Couldn't write a thing. And that's when I started writing short stories. And I started with little spin-offs from this bigger novel I was struggling with. And that one about these, killer jellyfish in a near future world, that is part of this bigger novel, which I don't know if it'll ever get published, but maybe someday. So there is like much more world building in that and other characters and whatnot.
Okay,
But
I feel it.
that was
I
like an
felt
extra.
it. I felt a disturbance in the force. I saw where you were going. So okay, so I'm not crazy. There should have been more, and yes, there should be. So puddle of camaraderie, despair. That's quite an opening line you got there. And I have it here. When I came to, I was a collapsed pile of half liquefied bones in the middle of 148th Street. Literally, no shit, just lying there like an egg frying and bored kids, and a bored kids driveway. So, that's quite a you start with a liquefied person as an opening line. What can you tell me about that story? Where that came from?
That's probably one of the weirdest ones. I'm glad you mentioned it because I think it's really fun. I really like that one. Um, that one, I don't know. I'm trying to remember what the inspiration for it was, and I can't recall. It might have been just a picture of a skeleton, and just kind of a lot of my short stories come from an image. I'll just look at a random image of something and kind of spin off a short story there. So I think this was an image of a skeleton, and I thought, what would be a really weird thing to happen with the skeleton? So kind of came from there. Another New York story. This skeleton guy, he doesn't know like why he's there, what's happening. So eventually he convinces this girl who's passing by to help him out. And he sort of fuses with her to some degree and then helps her solve her problem, which is a toxic and abusive landlord. Um, this one I like too because I feel like it's a little more of a happy ending. Like I picture them kind of going off and being superheroes in the city. Um, but yeah, that one's just it's a weird one that I really enjoy. So I'm glad you liked it too.
And so unrest was the cemetery.
Yep, that's right.
Some that I like that one too a lot. I'm not entirely certain I entirely know what that lady was up to, but that's okay. Ambiguity sometimes is a good thing. That was one that I thought stood out. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that one I actually did for an anthology that was a tribute to Anne Rice, edited by Rebecca Rowland from a few years ago. And it kind of has that gothic, right, vibe with the cemetery, but the inspiration from it actually came from this is kind of random, but the music video of Thriller, where he pulls up in the car with his date, he's going to turn into a werewolf. So that opening scene is okay. Here's a couple pulling up in front of a cemetery. How can I make this different and play with expectations? So as we find out from the opening, the main character, she knows that he is a threat, right? He has a knife, he has ill intentions, but so does she. And she is sort of the reluctant conveyor of justice for his victims. And it's also a story a little bit about kind of relationships that aren't great for us, but that we want to stay in, right? So this conveyor of vengeance. She is his girlfriend. She's a supernatural entity, but she also cares for him. So she has this human love for him. So she wants him to be better than he is. She wants him to overcome his desire for destruction. So that's sort of where the origins of that story came and just kind of playing with that and those expectations.
Yeah, and in a very effective story. And then Purelings seems like another one where you may have spun off from something larger into the piece, and that obviously I can see a little bit of your love of xenomorphs and the alien, the whole
Yeah.
thing, and I like this one. I thought it was a great fitting ending, but am I correct in saying that there you've got more in mind in that universe, in that world?
Yes, I do. And that one is actually an older one that I wrote a while back, and it was published in a sci-fi horror anthology. And that one came from a fully formed dream, which is always nice. Sometimes, I don't know if that's happened to you, but where you have a dream and it's a story and you write it. Like, great, I wish this would happen all the time. So that one was like a very vivid nightmare, pretty much with the full story arc. So I just woke up and captured it. And yes, that one I would love to expand on someday.
Well, I'm here for it. I enjoyed that one quite a bit. Is there any stories in here that I didn't mention that are favorites of yours?
Um, it's hard to pick. They're like children, right? Like you like
Yeah,
them for different reasons. It's hard to pick a favorite. I will say I find the Circus King kind of getting very interesting reception. Like a lot of people seem to love that one, and that's their favorite, which totally surprised me because it's a quiet, that's the one about the circus, and this girl is sort of trapped as um the ringmaster in a circus. And I almost didn't include it because I felt like it's a little slower paced. I don't know. I was feeling kind of mixed about it, but a lot of people said it was their favorite, which I just, it's funny as a writer, you don't always know what's going to resonate. And I do think it's really fun to hear what stories people like the most. It's almost like a personality test to some degree too. But that one surprised me. Let's see, the apocalypse one with the zombies, that is definitely a favorite too. A lot of people seem to really like that one,
that's
which
where
I
I was talking about the power chords, because you definitely, and I highlighted in my review one of the scenes from, and I can look at my notes. I did highlight a part of that one. Um, but I definitely did think that the part where they're kind of complaining about, like, oh God, here, why couldn't these zombies be more effectively a part of society or whatever? I think that was, as the author of a zombie satire myself, I have clearly had those thoughts before, but yeah, that was one I like too. Yeah.
Mm.
So
Pseudopod actually did a audio version of that one as well.
nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I'll have to find that. Well, I mean, you basically have heard all the ones that are my favorites, so for sure already. But um, and I think yeah, I mean, our little trip down to the subway is definitely my personal favorite. But if I had to pick one, but you know, the bottom line is I've very much enjoyed my time with this collection. So you've sold me. I mean, I was already sold having worked with you on Stokercon, so I would have been sold anyways. But
Oh, thank you. Well, I appreciate that. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It
yeah,
was you never know when a book comes out how it's going to go. So, but people seem to like it, and I really appreciate the support.
right. And there's something about a collection connecting with people because it's kind of the mixtape.
Mhm.
It's the thing that kind of like shows off your wider personality, and so it's always a good thing when those connect. What is next for you? I mean, we're in the spoiler territory, so I don't know. I mean, I would think that people who've listened this far are already sold on your work. So what do they have to look forward to next?
Yeah, so I have some short stories coming out and various anthologies. And I'll just throw in here my website, kcgrifant.com. I have kind of all the upcoming stuff. But so lots more short stories. The next Melinda West, called Melinda West and the Goblin Queen, is coming out next year. I have a kind of haunted house novella that I recently finished that I'm shopping around. I describe it as Invasion of the Body Snatchers plus House on Haunted Hill. We'll see. I don't, hopefully it finds a home. And then kind of a side project, I actually have a card game that will be coming out next year that's based on characters from my Weird West world. So super excited about that. And I'll have more information about that coming soon.
Neat. Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds really cool. And of course, those of you who are here in San Diego, you can see Kristina around at events. We've got all kinds of things coming up in the near future, so look out for that. I mean, the main work is done. We really deserve a break a little bit after Stokercon, so relax,
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
It was a lot. And let me just give you a shout out too for all your help with StokerCon. For those watching or listening, David kept all the panels running on time, which is no small feat. When you're managing that many people and that many panels, I think we had over 80, right? It was a
103 pieces of
oh my
programming.
gosh. Okay, with the author readings too.
Yeah.
David was on the ball. It was great. So
Well,
thank you for
and Kate Jones booking everything.
yeah.
She did amazing work. So hey, and I should say too that we do have I am working on a panel for the podcast with Kate and Eunice to talk about from the old fogies perspective of the ways that younger writers could do a better job of maximizing their time at StokerCon. I had a horrifying moment during Mort Castle's lifetime achievement acceptance, where I saw a young writer who I'd seen going in and out of workshops all weekend walk out in the hallway and say, "Old guy talking, blah, blah, blah." And this was 5 minutes after Paul Tremblay did an amazing job of introducing him. And
Oh.
it really hit me that a lot of people aren't respecting the elders that have come before them in this scene. And I kept thinking to myself, and I'm not saying that this individual did this, but a lot of the younger people were sweating bullets over their pitch sessions and things. And a lot more of the work gets done in the relationships that you build in the horror community
Mm.
than in those 3 minutes. I mean, this book came together in a pitch session, so that's a bad example, but that's a good example, I guess. But I'm saying is, like, I didn't do any pitch sessions. I had 3 offers to read my latest novel just by walking around, talking to people, and being a part of everything, right?
Yeah.
And that reaction that I saw in the hallway should never happen. It should never happen.
Yeah, that's a really good idea to give tips around those because I agree people get very fixated on the pitch session, which I totally understand, but it's sort of like dating. Like they're either gonna like your book or not, and extra preparing is not going to make a difference, right? It's you already have your concept, your book, whatever it is. If you're a little nervous, it's not gonna matter. If you fumble over your pitch, it's not gonna matter that much. But I think you're right,
And
a lot less.
F. Paul Wilson's walking around with 45 years of horror experience saying, "I don't know anyone here except for like 5 of you." He said that to me at one point. Like, I only know a couple of you here. And like these younger people are not going up and introducing themselves and saying, which is how I spent StokerCon 2005 when it wasn't called StokerCon then. It was the Stoker Awards weekend. But, I was walking around trying to talk to legends, and 15, 20 years later, that's why they're walking up and saying hello to me, right? And don't know these young people. It's just a thing, but we'll get more into it.
Like that. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of room for ideas there. Like just off the top of my head, as the co-organizer, maybe there's something where some of their key works of these lifetime achievement awardees are shared ahead of time, right? Or just
Yeah.
something to bridge that gap of knowledge because they are guests of honor or lifetime achievement winners for a reason, right? They're not picked
Yeah.
randomly. Like they have these huge bodies of work. So I think that's a really great piece of feedback.
Yeah. But and the fact of the matter is that anybody that knows me knows, especially more so science fiction than horror, but I'm absolutely um, tied to the history of the genre and want everyone to be thinking about the history of the genre. And I think that they will be better for it. And but this could be old man shouting at trees, so clouds. So it is what it is. But Kristina, I want to let you go. You got bedtime to attend to. I have dog food to go wrangle. And so I got to jump on my bike before it gets dark. But I really appreciate your time. I loved this book. It was great. And I'm really looking forward to the audio version of what's that story? U-Train. Yeah, that one really got me. That was the one where I was like, oh hell yeah. Yeah. And and no matter who the author is, when I read a collection, there's usually one story that I thought that's the one for me. Or I'm like, and I think you were really in the zone when you wrote that one. So rock on, as it were. And for folks that made it this far, next up on Postcards from a Dying World, another Stokercon important person, James Chambers, will be coming on to talk about his short story collection, The Bright and Eternal World of Cosmic Horror. So James will be next. 2 short story collections in a row. And if you count the last interview was a novella collection with Josh Mallerman. So, got a lot of collections in a row. So thank you for your time. Is there anything else you want to tell everybody before we go?
No, just read more horror. And thank you, David, for a great conversation. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, Kristina. And I will see you around town.
Sounds good.
And so thanks everybody. And as always, keep it paranoid out there and write good horror. And we'll see you next time.